everything needs to be optimized to within an inch of its life. If you've seen a pit stop in motor racing, like that's what we're talking about now, because now we're in the microseconds territory. Every tiny moment counts.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And on today's episode, we're going to talk about what it takes to be a founder in the AI era. Running startups, leading a team, and being a CEO in this era is radically different than it was even 2 years ago. We're going to talk about what's changed and how you need to adapt to win. We're going to talk about strategic acumen. We're going to talk about human-centric skills. We're going to talk about mastery of the human-AI interface. And we're going to talk about building a defensible moat. This is what remains. This is what becomes more important now that you have AI to help you execute. So all of that and much more on this week's show. Stay tuned.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Okay, Chris, so I wanted to jump in. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a startup and a startup founder in this accelerating era of AI. You know, we used to say ideas are cheap, execution is everything. In fact, that was, I believe, our very, very first episode of this podcast was talking about ideas are cheap. That's still true, but what if AI makes execution also cheap, or at least fundamentally different? So today we're going to explore how AI changes the startup game and where the real battleground for startups has now shifted.
Sounds awesome. Let's do it.
Basically, what I wanted to do here is to talk about, what are the main areas that you need to be really, really good at now with your startup in order to succeed, now that execution is cheap. And I think the underlying point I wanted to make here, Chris, is that building a startup has not gotten any easier. I just wanted to repeat that. Building a startup has not gotten any easier. Why is that? Because these incredible tools that are available to everyone, right? And so you get no competitive advantage by the existence of these tools. So it's still the same brutal competitive battleground. Imagine, perhaps you used to be a runner and you used to run marathons and you were really good at running. Now motorcycles were invented and we said, okay, instead of marathons, we're now going to have motorbike races. Everyone gets a motorbike. It doesn't get any easier to win the race, but the way you win the race has completely changed. You need to adapt. And there are 4 main ways that I wanted to talk about, Chris. We'll dive into each of these in a fair bit of detail, where you really need to get incredibly good in order to win this new type of race. Those 4 areas are strategic acumen and vision, human-centric skills, mastery of the human-AI interface, and then finally, really thinking about how you build that defensible moat when execution is no longer that moat in itself.
And of course, like all good clickbaity, you really want to stick to the end to hear that one. That's where it really gets interesting.
That's right. Do not go anywhere or bad things will happen, guys. Okay. All right. So let's start with strategic acumen and vision. Now, strategy was always important, right? And there's that old quote, strategy eats execution for breakfast or whatever it is. But this has just gotten more so, right? When the execution is cheap, when you can get a lot done quickly and cheaply, it's the choices of what you get done, how you get them done. That's going to be really the difference between succeeding and failing. That's really where it's at. And there are a few different areas I wanted to dive into here with you, Chris. And the first of these is willpower. And actually, this is me learning from you and you learning from Mark Zuckerberg when, you've mentioned on this podcast before that he said this thing about how the human thing that it's very hard for AI to replicate is that sort of that prime mover, right? The idea that something is worth doing in the first place, that sense of drive. And so, I think that's kind of at the core of a startup, right? It's very hard without that willpower to really build a successful startup. But again, even more so now.
Yeah, that's right. What he was saying was, we've replicated a form of reasoning, but we have not replicated consciousness and we've not replicated will. And that people tend to conflate these things together when they think of AI. So yeah, you're right. AI, at least today, doesn't seem to have its own will. It doesn't seem to have its own intuition, its own objective functions, if you will. And so, of course, one of your unique superpowers in this equation of where where do you as a founder and where does your startup fit in the post-AI world is just having the inclination in the first place to do something, to observe a problem in the world, to observe pain, suffering, inefficiency, waste. I heard someone say many opportunities in the world are the lack of joining two tables in a database together. It's like, hey, why do these two things not connect? And so you as, the founder in this new AI world need to notice the problem. And we've talked many times before about this idea that when technology, culture, or regulations shift, massive new opportunities emerge, massive. And usually only one of these things shift at a time. But we're now in a time when culture is radically shifted to the right, especially in the US. Regulations are going to radically shift, again, thanks to Trump and what have you. And the technology is radically shifted because of the move to AI. And so you have to use your will, your intuition, your taste, your observation to say, hey, I want to go solve that. I want to go make a change in the world. AI is not going to do that for you.
That's right. It can give you the ideas, but ultimately you're going to have to choose one of them and kind of go all in, right? And that is that willpower. And it's, it's that little bit of that human magic still that AI hasn't got. Okay, so the next area in strategic acumen and vision I wanted to talk about was problem selection and definition, right? So related to that willpower, you've got the willpower. Now you've got a whole universe of problems that you might want to solve. And again, we've talked about ideas are cheap before. So I'm not saying the idea, the thing that you're going to build, that is cheap. But finding an area that you want to go deep on, that you believe has all the characteristics that are required in order to build a successful startup, that is still your job as a founder. You cannot meaningfully outsource that to an AI. That's where you use your willpower.
I feel like I've invented a new term recently because I've been searching around and I can't find anyone using it. This idea of the MVP, but where the P is problem, minimum viable problem. And so you might have identified one of these things in the world, like, wow, there's a new opportunity here, it's huge. Identifying that, deciding you want to tackle it, and then deciding what is the minimum viable problem, the embarrassingly narrow thing you're going to start with, and using your understanding of humans, your understanding of markets, your understanding of relationships to say, hey, this is the wedge in the world. This is the place to start of the 1,000 other possible entry points. And so, yeah, you're ultimately going to have to make that choice for yourself and for your startup.
That's right. And, it's one of those things. By the way, I'm not meaning to say here, Chris, that you cannot and should not be leveraging AI for this, right? Like the idea that AI can help you find that problem to solve and to find that problem to solve, I think that is extremely powerful and you should probably be doing that. But ultimately, the call is yours. And, one of my favorite little funny sayings that I think is relevant in this case is, they say, have you heard about the plate of bacon and eggs? The chicken's involved, but the pig's committed, right? And there's this idea of that varying commitment levels. And in a way, if you think about partnering with AI to build your startup, the AI is involved, but you're committed. And that is something that cannot be simulated, right? This is sort of like the movie Her, which I know you love, Chris, where Samantha has, millions of lovers at once, right? So she's not really committed to any one of those relationships. Like OpenAI is not committed to your startup the way you are, no matter what it says, no matter how you prompt it. It doesn't have that same level of human all-in commitment. And so you should use your AI absolutely as a thought partner, but the choice is yours. The commitment is yours alone. And that is where you really need to apply that willpower and that discretion to pick the right minimum viable problem. I like that term, except that it's just going to confuse people, but because it's also MVP. But yes, the right problem to solve, that is your choice alone. So the next thing, closely related really, is a unique solution design, right? So this is, I guess, more the traditional MVP, the minimum viable product, right? You've figured out what problem you want to solve. Now you need to figure out, what's the V1 or what's the first version of your solution to that going to be? And, I don't think we need to labor this point. It's somewhat the same as the previous one where it's like, okay, you can use AI as a thought partner to define the strategy, right? This is sort of like where to play, how to win. It can be a fantastic analyst, but ultimately it's your call, right? So you get all the choices in front of you. You have to be that executive, right? So another way of thinking about all of this willpower stuff, Chris, it just occurred to me, is the traditional meaning of an executive, right? In a larger company is, you're the person who makes the calls, right? You don't do the work yourself. People go off and do the analysis. They bring proposals to you. They give you different options. You decide which ones to do. And then you tell other people to go do it, right? That's somewhat an oversimplification, but the executive function is a decision-making function. And so what we're saying is now, even at an early stage startup, your role as a founder is more and more that of an executive, right? Of marshalling those inputs and outputs and making the key decisions, doing the synthesis and setting things into motion.
Yeah, and I think this connects to the other bullet points you have here, Yaniv, so I'm going to bring them in. You can collaborate with your AI, you can figure out what the solution is, but this is going to take taste, judgment, and strategic foresight, and it's going to take decisiveness, right? So in my work in advisory of companies and founders, often that's precisely what's missing, is they have all of the ideas, they sweat all the details, they stay up at night, rocking back and forth, crying about all the possibilities, but they have not been decisive about which of the possibilities they've chosen to pursue. And they can't quite apply taste and judgment to the problem, either because they're too close to it or they don't have the experience. And so this is now, we're getting into the world of what are you uniquely qualified to do that an AI cannot do? And AI does not have taste. It does not have judgment. And it cannot make the decision. Where founders would often get stuck in this part, this is sort of the only thing you have left to do is to make the decisions and apply judgment. And so it starts to become really, really critical.
I agree. And, it's funny, like decisiveness is actually where I started when I was ideating for this episode. And like this point is like that decisiveness, that willpower piece is about, applying your will to making a clear decision. And, again, AI is an accelerant of things that are already true. Right? So already at a startup, it's true. I'm sure we've talked about it in previous episodes, right, Chris? Which is making no decision. Indecision is one of the most problematic things, right? It can really slow you down. If you as a founder are not clear, decisive, acting quickly, that indecision will kill you. Well, okay. Now, if AI means execution is much faster, that cycle of decide, learn, adapt, decide, learn, adapt is accelerated massively, then any human delays in making clear decisions and prioritizing and doing this and not that, well, the impact of those decisions in terms of slowing down that faster cycle is larger, right? So if instead of taking a month to try something new, it takes 2 days, and you take 2 days to decide instead of taking 1 hour to decide, well, instead of adding 3% to your cycle time, you've doubled your cycle time, right? So that is a huge, huge problem. You need to be so quick. You need to be so on the ball. It's actually, to me, the existence of AI, it's kind of a stressful thought, right? Because it really puts that pressure back on you as a founder to be able to make these decisions quickly, with taste, with judgment, with cohesion, right? That executive function. I'm going to come back to that. I actually think I want to rehabilitate the word executive, which has lost a lot of meaning, because I think that is really what is left for you as a founder, is to be that executive. And you need to get really, really good at those executive skills if you're going to be able to effectively lead your little AI army to success.
Yeah, when I first started thinking about AI and my own work, my advisory work, I was like, I'm not sure if people need a Chris in an AI world. But the more I dig into it, the more I work with founders, the more we're talking about it today, the more I realize that this is precisely what I do, right? This taste, this judgment, this decisiveness. So it is.
If anything, it's more that Chris doesn't need them anymore, right?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, this is in many ways has been difficult and is now the bottleneck. And so you need to be careful about it becoming the bottleneck in your business, because other founders are racing past you.
There's this nearly dichotomy of building is becoming more frantic, but in that frenetic pace, you need to still maintain that taste, that judgment, that strategic foresight. You can't just be throwing spaghetti at a wall. What you need to do is in fast forward, right? I know some of you listen to this podcast at 1.5 speed, 2 speed, 2.5 speed. You're running your startup in this fast forward motion, right? How do you continue to play well, make good decisions in that fast forward motion? That is the skill you need to hone. And maybe that's a good place to kind of put a bow on this first of the 4 areas that you need to really dial in on to win. And, we're kind of encompassing all of this in what you could call wisdom. And Chris, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, this set of things we've just talked about, I would encapsulate as wisdom. Wisdom is knowing what to do, when to do it, and how to do it all together. There's a phrase that I really like, which is information is data in context. And then you could say knowledge is information in context. I've extended it for myself, and I say wisdom is information in context. It's being able to take those patterns and knowing when to apply them. and to do them with taste and judgment and strategic foresight. Wisdom becomes perhaps the most valuable commodity, particularly in this strategic acumen and vision part of the conversation.
Rapid fire wisdom. So, like, one of the things I love about doing these episodes, Chris, is, we do a bit of preparation for this. We have a run sheet, but often, I think I'm someone who thinks by speaking. So by the end of it, I've actually come up, I feel like I understand what we're talking about better than when we started. So I would nearly reframe this whole section, wisdom at speed, which it nearly sounds contradictory, right? I guess, stereotypes of wisdom is, your llama sitting on top of a mountain, thinking profound thoughts in a leisurely way, right? Whereas what we're saying is that core faculty of judgment and decisiveness, that executive function, making good decisions, now has to be done in fast forward, right? Rapid fire wisdom, I think, is actually going to be where the best founders are winning. And it's a very tricky place to be, but that is what the world is forcing on us. So the next major area where you're going to have to be really good to succeed as a founder, and again, none of these things are new. What we're saying is the nexus of competition has moved from execution to these things. These things have become more important. And so this one is human-centric skills, right? All the people stuff that you can't just use an AI for has just become more important. I think the first of these is leadership and culture. This is maybe less important at the very early stages, but as soon as you have a few people on your team, this becomes really important, right? Like, how do you inspire a team? How do you set values? How do you build resilience? Things are changing really fast, right? AI is changing everyone's jobs, right? So this is kind of fractal. You need to build a team that is able to execute effectively during this period of rapid change and uncertainty. Now, how do you do that? You do that with your very human skills of leadership and communication. And so I think, in the past, maybe a founder, especially in the early days, could get away with maybe not being such a great people leader, but being more of a incredible technologist and executor. Well, now that execution is less important, the people side of it, even as you hire fewer people, becomes more important. What do you think of that, Chris?
Yeah, with everybody kind of a bit confused about their roles now and, using AI to do various bits and pieces and wondering what they should outsource, I'm finding people having a great deal of anxiety about their roles. And so reestablishing your culture, establishing it well and reestablishing it in the face of AI is becoming more important than ever. It's almost like what I used to say to engineers before AI, which is, your job is not to write code. Your job is to ship products. And similarly, now in the face of AI, when you're talking to a marketer or a designer or whatever, a copywriter, your job is not to design pixels or write copy. Your job is to ship outcomes, to make outcomes happen. And so if you can outsource 99% of your job to an AI, that's fantastic. I will promote you. And so building a culture of we deliver results, not we deliver code, we deliver pixels, we deliver whatever the hell, is really important. And so this is stuff that AI can't do. So helping your team understand their role, understand the rate of change is accelerating, understand how to relate to each other, understand you building relationships with VCs, with your team, with your executive team, with your customers. You can't outsource that. Now, sure, they can do some outbound sales lead gen or some customer support, but they're not going to ultimately play golf with the right people and help you close that deal.
That's right. So, I think there's three areas, and you've already touched on these, Chris, where I think those deep relationships and that leadership becomes super important, the human factor, right? Now, the first of these is sales, right? Now, sure, we've been through a whole wave of product-led growth and product-led sales and self-serve and all of that. And, that remains true. But, currently I'm working at a B2B SaaS company that sells to enterprise. It sells to that sort of upper mid-market, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of employees. And I would say that, the human factor of sales has not gone away one iota. Maybe there are fewer golf course lunches or whatever, but that relationship aspect is just as important as ever, right? So in a world where building the technology is becoming cheaper and more commodified, well, that selling relationship, that's actually where you're going to win. Sales is becoming more important, not less important. So I would say that's the first one. We've talked about the fact that you're going to need to hire fewer people or hire more slowly, but that just means that each hire is even more critical, right? So really finding those amazing people and then convincing them that they should be working with you, well, that is as critical a skill as ever, again, if not more so, putting together a small killer team, right? Because what are we saying here? Why is this more important? Let me actually dig into that, right? if we're saying so much of that execution, that sort of the muscle work is going away, right? The doing things, every role is nearly becoming more of this executive function, this thinking, this decision-making, this taste, and so on. This is not just at the founder level. This cascades down to every role in an organization, right? A designer is no longer pushing pixels around, as you say, Chris. An engineer is no longer writing code. No, they're thinking a higher level of abstraction. So the talent density of your team has just become even more important, right? So you hire fewer, better people. There are not that many of those people around. You better be good at finding them and judging and evaluating them and then convincing them to work with you.
It's actually quite funny because when you have a larger team, there are more people around to catch the fuck ups of the poor performers. When you are working with AI, if you have a poor performer, their bad decisions, their bad taste is being amplified by AI. And so there are fewer people around to catch their nonsense. You're absolutely right, Yaniv. You need really high quality people with high quality judgment and taste and intuition, all the things we talked about in the first section, with high quality prompting and AI usage skills, who are self-motivated because there's no one looking over their shoulder. There's no team that's holding them accountable. There are fewer people around to catch and compensate for their nonsense. And so you just need the very best people, and then they can get amplified and operationalized by AI.
Yeah. Now, the third genuine relationship human-centric skill here I wanted to mention was raising capital. Now, this has not gone anywhere. I think there's a lot of discussion about how AI might lower capital requirements. I think that's probably true in the very early stages of a startup when you're doing that sort of the MVP, proving out product market fit. Maybe pre-seed rounds are less important than they used to be. But I would say, again, if we've moved from running to riding motorbikes, this has not become any less competitive. There are still plenty of spaces where capital is going to give you a massive leg up on your competition. So, in my view, raising isn't going anywhere. And so being able to raise capital becomes, again, an even more important skill because it's often that capital that allows you to do the things that your competitors can't do now that they can execute cheaply, right? Now that there's just going to be, building SaaS can now be done with $1,000. Well, okay, so what is $1 million going to get you? That is going to be the thing that is your moat, right? It will be the distribution, the marketing, hiring that right talent, all of that, Chris. This is just as important as it's ever been. The final human-centric skill I wanted to talk about was deep customer empathy, right? And this kind of ties back a little bit to that first one, our first section around willpower, taste, judgment, wisdom. If you want to be able to choose that great minimum valuable problem, and then you want to be able to put that into market, talk to customers, learn what's working, what's not, iterate, and get to that point of incredible product market fit and that hockey stick growth. Well, one thing you're going to need to be really, really good at is understanding your customers and understanding that feedback. And again, AI can be a helpful tool, but this is a deeply human skill. And at least for now, I think that is something that resides with you as a founder because it ties in so deeply to building out your mental model of the problem space and allowing you to basically, this is the substrate that allows you to have that wisdom, Chris, that allows you to work really well. So I think that empathy for customers is more important than ever.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because one of the biggest mistakes that product managers make, that salespeople make, that anyone that has influence over product makes, is they hear a request from the customer and they go, oh, well, the customer wants the button to be blue. I guess we should make it blue. And it's completely fucking wrong. It's like, no, it should not be blue. The customer is wrong and you should not listen to them. And here's why. It doesn't align to the strategy in this 5 different ways. And the customer actually doesn't want a blue button. They actually want their problem to be solved. So actually delete the button and make the interface green. And that will actually solve the problem in a better way and in a way that is more strategic to our vision. Bad product managers don't know how to do this, or at least inexperienced product managers. And AI doesn't know how to do this because AI is so amenable. It's so compliant. It's submissive. So you give it a bunch of information, they'll go, oh yeah, no worries. I can organize that for you. And what you actually need is to do deep listening, have deep strategy, have a deep empathy for what the customer is really going through. And then again, it connects all the way back to our first topic here, which is judgment and taste. And so it's about using the relationships, using your empathy, and having taste and judgment to come up with the right answer. And an answer that AI probably can't give you here because it is just so damn amenable.
So the third area of our battleground here, Chris, is sort of a bit of a meta one, right? Which is mastery of the human AI interface. We talked about the fact that in a way, AI doesn't change the playing field, right? Because this is a tool that's available to everyone. So it doesn't give you a competitive advantage. And I think in the steady state, that's true, right? Like once everybody gets good at this, then there will be no competitive advantage for everyone. But we're in a really unique time, Chris, which is that these incredibly powerful tools have been unleashed on the world. People don't really know how to use them well and effectively. And so there is a temporary competitive advantage, an arbitrage, if you will, to be gained here, which is to get really, really good at using AI before all of your competitors do. This reminds me of, the early days of cloud where, a lot of people were still mucking around with on-prem or at least with bare metal servers, and people who knew how to leverage AWS as it rolled out could get a big advantage in execution speed. Well, that's available to you now. And so a core skill as a founder is to get really, really good at using AI. So everything we've said so far is actually true. And I think there are actually a few things here that are core. There's sort of the direct thing, right, Chris, which is prompt engineering and AI management. I guess I don't love the term prompt engineering, but, actually maybe prompt design is a better term. But like the idea of how do you set up your AI tool chain and then how do you talk to it in a way that it does what you want it to do, right? This is not trivial. And, in a lot of ways, it's about understanding AI as much as anything, though. Here's the funny thing is it's about understanding what you want, right? This is not that different from managing humans. Clear prompts will lead generally to good outcomes. Vague prompts will lead to bad outcomes. But there is, quite a lot of nuance here. I'm looking at, working with my team at UpGuard about like, how do we use tools like Cursor to really accelerate our coding velocity? And it's not trivial to use these things, right? Because getting all the prompting right, they have these things called rules, which are basically, conditionally executed prompts for context. And, there's actually documenting your code and modularizing it effectively for AI. So, that's a coding example. I imagine the same is true no matter what domain you're using AI in within your startup. You need to get good at understanding these tools and learning. Learning has become a massively more important part of your role as a founder because, and frankly, as any worker at a startup, we talked about this actually in a recent episode of Reacts, Chris. The Shopify memo. Learning how to use AI is a core part of this job. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. So that is like the fundamental layer. But Chris, there's actually a few things here that are not directly to do with mastering AI, but are important enabling factors to allow you to use AI effectively. And I wanted to dive into those. The first of these is process design. This sounds a bit kind of dry and boring, but again, we're talking about here that we've got a process where we used to have a way of working to like ship a new version of your software or whatever it is, right? How you make decisions, how you get feedback and so on. Even if they're a bit loose, at worst, they maybe slowed you down by 10%. What if that 3.5 weeks is now compressed to 3.5 days? All of these things that previously only resulted in single-digit percentages lost in efficiency are suddenly slowing you down by massive amounts, right? Because they are stopping you from iterating in 1 or 2 days. Instead, you're iterating in 4 or 5 days. Well, you're half the speed that you could be. I'm going to stick with my analogy, Chris, of like the marathon runner is suddenly forced to go into a motorbike race, because I think it really does illustrate this fairly well, right? Like imagine you're running a marathon, you've watched one of these on TV, every few kilometers there's a water station. The runner kind of slows down a bit, picks up a glass of water, drinks the water, and then kind of discards the cup. Perhaps an amateur marathon, they might even stop for a moment and take a breather, right? And that cost them a few seconds, and that doesn't matter that much in the scheme of running the marathon. But now imagine if in a motorbike race, every few kilometers, there was a water stand, the motorcyclist basically had to slow down, pull over, take the helmet off, take a glass of water, drink it, give it back, get on the bike and start accelerating again. They do that once, they come last, right? That is it. There is no time for that because like the speed of everything else is so fast that the cost of doing something that just takes a few seconds is going to compound so massively that it's going to cost you, right? And so that's what's happening here, right? All of those little bits of dead time that didn't matter that much when the general pace was slow, now matter a huge amount. They can start to dominate that sort of iteration cycle. And so, yeah, cutting out those inefficiency, I've written aggressive bottleneck removal here, right? Which is very much aligned with process design, I would say that is what you're optimizing for with your process design, is anything that's a bottleneck, anything that slows you down, even for a few hours, even for a couple of days, right? That can really compound so much more now that the other stuff is moving quickly. So you just can't afford to have that anymore. Everything needs to be optimized to within an inch of its life. If you've seen a pit stop in motor racing, like that's what we're talking about now, because now we're in the microseconds territory. Every tiny moment counts.
It's a great metaphor. And it's, it's also about proportions, right? The drink was a small proportion of the overall race. Now the drink is just so massively impactful.
Being really thoughtful about that entire life cycle of how you go from customer discovery through to product design, through to execution, through to shipping, through to getting customer input, all of this stuff, so that you don't have any dead time, any slack time, right? We're more frenetic now. We need to move faster. Inefficiencies in the process suddenly cost us a whole lot more. So having a really good process that allows you to move quickly has suddenly become this critical thing from a much earlier stage than perhaps it used to be.
Yeah, I think people might be wondering at this point, why do you keep talking about like frenetic pace and going faster and faster? And like, what is the connection between AI and faster? I think there are some obvious connections, but I think there are some non-obvious connections as well. So let's just unpack that a little bit. It used to take hours to write copy and days to make a website and weeks or months to make software. And now it takes seconds to write copy and maybe 20, 30 minutes of fooling around to make a web page, a landing page, and maybe a couple of hours to make software, right? That is a massive speed improvement, right? Productivity gain. And so what that means is, startups were always about speed. They're always about minimizing opportunity cost, maximizing velocity and momentum. VCs invested in companies that were growing fast, executing fast. They wanted times on bat. You want to learn, iterate, and go quick. They were always about speed. But now you have an entire ecosystem, especially in Silicon Valley, of these young AI native founders who are going faster than you can possibly imagine. And to the degree that you have any delay in your business and your iterations, you are moving like a snail compared to their rabbit. And so this is why, Yaniv, I think you're talking about speed so much, is that the rate of change and therefore the rate of disruption is accelerating beyond recognition. And so if you're in a legacy company, startups are going to kill you. And if you're in a old style startup, AI native startups are going to kill you. So speed is the name of the game. And again, to go all the way back to the beginning, if you don't have really senior people who are decisive with taste and judgment and wisdom, you don't have really great human skills to connect with customers and investors and raise the capital and sell the things you need to sell. And here, you don't have a great process so that the humans are getting out of the way of the AI. You are, by definition, going more slowly than these Stanford grads, Stanford dropout, YC, accelerator, angel investor. This is a Silicon Valley startup, and you're going to get your ass handed to you.
Okay, and then the final thing I want to talk about in mastery of the human-AI interface is your data strategy. Now, talking about data has been fashionable for at least a couple of decades, ever since the term big data was invented, and then, all of these other sort of trends have happened. But again, AI is an accelerant. Why? Because, I think one of the reasons, Chris, that the sort of big data hype of the 2000s never quite delivered on its promise is that it's one thing to gather lots of data. That was made easy by the cloud, right? And by IT in general. You could gather lots and lots and lots of data. The hard thing was, what do you do with all that data, right? How, especially if it's not super clean, if it's not super structured, you've just got, gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes of data piling up in your data lake, in your data warehouse. What do you do with all that stuff? How do you actually get analysis out that helps your business? It took a great deal of sophistication. It was expensive. And so most companies, most startups got less value out of all of their data, especially if they were collecting it aggressively, than they had hoped. Well, AI is largely a solve for that, right? One of the things that AI is best at is summarizing, drawing insights from large volumes of semi-structured data, right? Like if you've got 1 million documents and you tell AI, read all these documents and, draw out some patterns, it's going to do a pretty good job. There was no good way of doing that in the past. And so having all of that data and having it kind of connected in one place, that is now becoming a whole lot more important, because the challenge of knowing what to do with it is kind of taken away. So the data is kind of the raw material that will fuel your AI to allow it to become the sort of domain expert in your business, to give you all of this insight and analytics and ultimately help you improve your product on the basis of what you collect. So now I think that big data is back again. I've actually not heard that, so maybe I'll take some credit for that. We like to take credit for things here, don't we, Chris? But I think that concept of big data is back again. I wouldn't have recommended 2-3 years ago that a startup basically log everything, store everything, remember everything. Now I'd say it's critical to do that. So having a really well thought through data collection strategy is a core aspect of mastering that human AI interface.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that except that it reminds me of something that is a watch out here. I can't tell you for how long after cloud came out that I still had founders and executives in Australia and other second, third tier markets saying, "Chris, we need to make sure that our app is going to scale." And it was such like a 90s thing to worry about. It's like, yeah, it's going to it'll scale, guys. Like scale it's not free, but it's not the first thing you need to worry about anymore. And it's just like this stuff scales. And then somewhere down the line, it started to be about like, Chris, we need the data. We're going to have the data. Our business is so clever because we're going to have all the data. We're going to collect the data. And it's like, it was such like a 2000s thing to say. It's like, it's all about the data. I would always have to remind them, like, what is the utility? What feature, capability, insight, analytics are you going to deliver? Stop talking to me about the data. You want to be careful now in this new cycle that you're not still talking about the last cycle's innovation and challenge, right? And I don't really know what that's going to be this time. It's like, we're building an app or something. I don't know what the passe thing is, and the thing from the last decade that everybody in Australia and Europe and Canada.
Well, I think it's execution, Chris. That's what we're talking about, mate. It's execution. It's like the idea that building software is the expensive thing. That is the hangover.
Yes, that's going to be the hangover, and that's the word, the hangover, the overhang. And so, yeah, all I wanted to say about this was that you reminded me of the overhang. Watch out for the overhang. And yeah, you're right. I guess what we're saying in today's episode is that the overhang is this sense that execution is the hard part. But no, taste, judgment, strategy, decision-making, that's the hard part.
Or the expensive part.
Yeah, the expensive part, yes. There's limits to this declaration, as you caveated at the start, Yaniv, which is high-quality execution with taste and judgment and the right kind of execution, still difficult to do. But the actual writing of code, the actual pushing of pixel, the actual writing of words, that part's the easy part.
I mean, another way of viewing it, which is probably more accurate and more nuanced, is that we're moving up that layer of the abstraction stack, right? And this is the history of humanity and automation, right? Like we've gone from hunter-gatherers to farmers to then, the Industrial Revolution, the Information Revolution. And each time as a human, we've had to put less muscle and more brain into what we do, right? And, I think prior to AI, what we said when we're building software is, sure, we're not out there using our literal muscles, but like we're kind of doing relatively repetitive rote tasks like writing code, like, pixel pushing in our designs and things like that. There's a role for that for employees. There's a role for that for early stage founders in particular, right? And in a way, that's nearly a cognitive break. That's what we're talking about. That the pace, that wisdom at speed is so critical now, because it's like, it used to be like you had an idea and then you went off and executed it. And while it wasn't mindless, it was less cognitively demanding work. Now we're saying, okay, all of that has gone away. Like the use of our muscles, even metaphorically, is nearly gone away entirely. Now we're nearly like, what's the ideal view of a founder? Is like you're a brain in a box, right? Like you just have ideas, you make decisions, you communicate what you want to an intelligent tool, and then it goes and does that thing for you. That's sort of the overhang, right? The idea that, even maybe the idea that the founder needs to kind of, really get their hands dirty and hustle on execution. Well, I don't think that founders are going to work any less hard, but the nature of the work is going to change. And if probably they're doing a whole lot of kind of repetitive manual stuff, the question is, why are you doing that rather than an AI agent that you have instructed to do so?
Yeah, and this actually reminds me of a founder I've been working with where ChatGPT has really thrown them through a loop. because they have so much information, so much execution capacity, so much data at their fingertips. They can't make heads or tail of it. They don't have the taste, the judgment, the intuition, the clarity of thinking. And so this, when we talk about, the human AI interface, it's also knowing what to do with that superpower, which also brings you all the way to the beginning, which is taste, judgment, and decisiveness.
That's right. And maybe to the extent that you are doing that sort of manual execution work yourself, what we used to say is at the early stage, the founder is building the thing, and eventually they migrate to that role of building the thing that builds the thing, meaning they're building an organization, they're hiring people, they're setting a clear strategy, they're communicating clearly, and then the people do the actual work, right? So the founder's not in the weeds building anymore, they're building the organization. Well, one way of putting this, Chris, is from day zero, you are building the thing that builds the thing. There is no building the thing stage, right? So to the extent that you are executing, what is your early execution as a founder is setting up this human AI interface, this AI substrate that you can then start to instruct. So from day one, you are building the thing that builds the thing. The final point I wanted to make, the final of these sort of 4 battlegrounds, is building a defensible moat. And, I guess this has always been the case, right? But again, what does it take to build a defensible moat changes. And I think this is really, in a way, a summary of the previous 3, Chris, right? Like, what are the things that allow you to have an enduringly successful startup today, right? It is less about your, ability to write lots of code or pump out lots of copy, right? Like SEO, for example, you have these companies that built their success on programmatic SEO and pumping out thousands of pages for search engine optimization. Well, guess what? Now anyone can do that very cheaply and very quickly. So that has completely gone away, right? Some of these moats have been drained by AI. So what are the ones that are not so easy to drain? And I'll start with where we were just speaking, Chris, which is with data. Proprietary data sets, unique data acquisition methods. I think this is one of those things where maybe there's been this sort of long-term hype cycle over data, right? Where for the last 2 decades, we've been talking data. And, you're ex-Uber, I'm ex-Google. I think it's true that at the extreme, some of the biggest Silicon Valley companies have been based on their ability to collect and learn from vast quantities of data. But I actually think for your average startup, for your mid-stage company, data has been less powerful than everyone had hoped it would be. And so I think there's been a bit of a trough of disillusionment around the value of big data and collecting vast quantities of data. Well, that's changed, right? One thing that people can't quickly copy is your vast amount of data that is proprietary and unique to you and that you have spent time and money and effort to gather. So that is one of your key moats. And I think, the more AI develops, the better it gets, the more value you're going to unlock in your data. So this is an appreciating asset. And you need to be thinking about how you start gathering and compounding that asset from day one.
Yeah, and if you're a startup that's truly starting from zero, you may not have collected or aggregated your own data, but what you may need to do is go get access to a proprietary data set from some partner, some other legacy company, and get some special exclusive or at least temporary access to it. And so you need to think about, hey, maybe I need to go partner with a Kaiser Permanente or something and go get their proprietary, insurance data and healthcare data so I can build some specialized agent on top. So you're going to need to think about what is the proprietary data set underneath the thing you're building.
Different ways of doing it, but you want to get a defensible data moat. Look, the next one I've got here is like unique AI models, fine-tuning for a specific niche. I think this is a way to establish a moat. I'm not sure it's the first way you should be going, right? There's this idea that, okay, you can, for example, it builds on the previous one. If you've got unique data, you can then use that data to fine-tune a model or to, have a special prompt for your model. So again, you're starting to create an AI that has abilities that nobody else is able to replicate. Why? Because it has access to data and information that no one else has access to, right? And a lot of wisdom and intelligence comes from knowledge. So we've got proprietary knowledge, and that means we have proprietary AI, and that can be a long-term moat. And again, one that is actually subject to a type of network effect, right? Because if we're talking about unique data acquisition, proprietary data, the more of that data you have, the more you're able to train the model, the more people feed data into that, the stronger the model gets. So I do think, Chris, I'm interested in your thoughts. That there is a type of winner takes all model here within a particular niche. If having a fine-tuned or contextualized AI model is a key part of your product, then whoever gathers the most customers, gathers the most data, is able to make the most effective use of it, is kind of going to run away with things. So this is like a new twist on the old network effects.
Yeah, we have to be careful here because there's a lot of concepts that are easy to conflate together, right? So there's data used as RAG, so used as a knowledge base on top of which the model is accessing information, retrieving information, and trying to generate results. And then there's data used to create new models from scratch or distilling to something new. And then there is data or reinforcement learning used to fine-tune a model to behave in a certain way. And these are very distinct things. And usually, and there's a kind of maybe a fourth thing, which is very specific prompting and system messages and instructions. These four things are probably the majority of the universe of things you can do to tailor the AI to your specific application, your specific use case, and to differentiate it. It takes quite a bit of understanding to know which of these techniques to use, depending on the problem you're solving and the money you have and the expertise you have and all this kind of stuff. I would say for most people, most of the time, because they don't have access to proprietary data, they're probably not sophisticated enough to do fine-tuning. They're not going to go build a model from scratch. Most of these companies, most of these startups, most of these apps are basically just wrappers using really clever prompting. And I don't think that that's zero value. So at the early days of startups, of AI startups, there was this kind of derision around, oh, it's just a wrap. I think there's a lot of value to very precise prompting and very precise system messages and very precise RAG, data sets they're not necessarily massive data sets, but they're particular data sets for a particular niche. And I think that is more valuable than we originally imagined. And it allows you to get started, and the wrappers can get more and more sophisticated over time. I think the next level of sophistication and moat, if we're talking about moats here, is fine-tuning. OpenAI has now launched fine-tuning tools and fine-tuning automation, and you can actually get quite a specialized behavior out of ChatGPT or GPT using their fine-tuning tools. And it's very much in lieu of creating your own model, and it can be very, very powerful tool. And it may not require all that much data. And then the kind of the most advanced and least likely thing that people listening are going to go do is go use massive data sets to go create a new model. I think almost nobody's going to go do that. It's a very complicated, world of subtleties and nuances. And sometimes you use multiple of these things together. But one last thing I will say, Yaniv, is I'm not sure how much of a moat this is as well. Like, I continue to be a little bit of a maximalist when it comes to some of these models. I think OpenAI today announced something called the Pioneer Program, and they're working with domain experts to fine-tune the model in each specific domain. And so in the fullness of time, and fullness meaning 12 or 24 months, ChatGPT, I think, is going to be not just tuned to be a generally good model, but I think it's going to start to be specially tuned to be a great medical model and a great construction model and a great material science model. I'm quite concerned for how much white space is left for everybody else.
I think it can be debated how much white space there is, but I think the narrower the niche, the more white space you're going to have available, right? What OpenAI is doing is exactly what every startup should be doing, which is trying to gather as much data as possible in order to lock in their network effect, right? Like that's what the Pioneer Program is. One of the ways in which you can get an advantage here is create models that do a better job in the domain that you're actually trying to build your product in. I think the next competitive area is strong brand and community, right? This is nothing new. Startups have been competing on brand and community for a while now. But again, when that execution moat gets drained, when that idea of, being able to build software that is similar to yours has become even quicker and cheaper in a lot of cases, well, having a strong brand, having a promise, having people who believe in you, who know you, who like you, gets just even more important, Chris. And so I think those companies that are able to invest in having a real brand from early on where people care about them, that's going to be a moat that is going to be actually harder to breach than copying the product features that perhaps they've built with their, embarrassingly narrow slice. And then the final one, we can wrap this up, Chris, is just having that superior team culture and human talent. We've talked about this one already. So again, like I said, this defensible moat is often is really a summary of the previous three. But if you're able to put together a killer team, no matter what tools are available, that team, that human talent is going to be the thing that gets you to the finish line faster than anyone else. Again, this has always been true, but it's now even more true, right? I think that's the theme here, Chris, of all of these things is they've always been true. But when you take away that execution cost or you significantly reduce that execution cost, then these things come to the fore. These are the things that are going to make the difference. I have a lot of difficulty seeing a startup with a smart idea and, a good execution and a mediocre team succeeding in this day and age. It's just not going to be possible.
Yeah, I mean, it might seem counterintuitive because we keep talking about how AI can do so much for you and, how a founder is now has these superpowers. But at the end of the day, you are going to need to hire some human beings. And as we said earlier in the episode, the quality bar of those human beings needs to be way higher. And the amplification of their effectiveness or the amplification of their ineffectiveness is going to be larger. And so the nature of your team is even more important, not less important in an AI world.
All right, Chris. Well, that was a fun episode, folks. I hope that's really helpful. I think our EDU topics are usually evergreen, and this is like a semi-evergreen, right? Because we're responding to a really massive trend that is changing everything in startups. I think this is going to continue to be true for quite a long time. So actually, Chris, this is one of the more important episodes we've done for a while, because this is about how do you succeed when everything around you is changing really quickly. Folks, if you need help, Chris, you are that executive function, right? You are the person who gets a strategic acumen, vision, willpower, decisiveness moving really quickly. So if you want help getting through this change and making sure that you are executing to win, you might want to work with Chris. Chris, how can people reach you?
Yeah, you can learn more about my work over at chrissaad.com/advisory or subscribe to my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter. How about you, Yaniv?
Well, I'm so special you don't get to work with me. Just kidding. But yeah, my calendar's kind of full these days, but I'm on LinkedIn trying to make it a less boring place, and I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. So if you would like to connect with me, let me know that you come from the pod and I will happily accept it. All right, Chris, that was fun. Have a great day.
All right, catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.